At the dawn of the 19th century, Anton Reicha jotted down these 16 chords. Harmonically, it's a baffling phrase to analyze, taking unexpected twists and turns that somehow find their way back to the starting point. But this isn't a standalone progression, it's the theme for a series of variations, each one bolder than the last. Imagine what his contemporaries, Haydn or Beethoven, would have thought of number 3, a rambling allegretto in quintuple meter. The book this music appeared in, Practical Examples, had an ambitious subtitle, a contribution to the intellectual culture of the composer and of those who wish to distinguish themselves through performance on the pianoforte, as well as toward the expansion of both arts, accompanied by philosophical practical remarks. Clearly, Ray-SHA was a very serious musician who sought to pioneer new ideas and educate others in the process. His piano music was a big part of that. He left behind dozens of innovative fugues, often with strange and awkward themes, colossal variation sets lasting 40 to 85 minutes in performance, and impossible-looking exercises mixing several staves, clefs, and keys at once. Most of these have been collecting dust for the last 2 centuries. So who was Anton Reicha, and what, if anything, is worthwhile for us to rediscover in his strange, long-forgotten piano works? Reicha was born in Prague in 1770, before moving to Bonn at age 15. There he befriended Beethoven, who was just 10 months younger than him. They attended the same lectures and even played in the same orchestra, Reicha in the flute section and Beethoven with the violas. But while Beethoven would go on to forge new paths in composition and performance, Reicha's musical influence would remain mostly theoretical. In 1818, he was appointed professor of counterpoint and fugue at the Paris Conservatoire, where he butted heads with his colleagues Cherubini and Fétis. They protested against Reicha's free approach to traditional techniques, such as how he thought fugue subjects should be allowed to answer in any scale degree rather than just the dominant. Another good example of Reicha's progressive thinking appears in his treatise on melody, where he recalled hearing a singer perform a series of quarter tones to transition at the end of a phrase. He then ponders over a theoretical microtonal keyboard that might help with the practice of such maneuvers. Reicha was an idealist. At a time when most orchestras ranged from 40 to 60 players, Reicha envisioned the ideal ensemble as having over 160 instruments, a preference he definitely had in common with his pupil Hector Berlioz. Speaking of pupils, Reicha also taught the young Franz Liszt in counterpoint and composition. Liszt would go on to become not just a great performer and composer, but an incredible sight reader who could dissect symphonies in full score on the spot. And perhaps he partially had Reicha to thank for that. Among the professor's teaching tools were these unusually tricky sight-reading tests, one to be read in 2 enharmonically equivalent keys, another where the clef changes after each note, and then there's this one, notated across 4 different staves at once, simulating the process of reducing a score at the piano. For all his ingenuity as a theorist and teacher, Reich-sha was a frustrated composer. Writing itself wasn't the problem. He produced hundreds of compositions, including symphonies, operas, chamber, and solo pieces, but his only publicly successful work was a series of wind quintets, a genre he helped pioneer. He wrote in his autobiography, "Many of my works have never been heard because of my aversion to seeking performances. I counted the time spent in such efforts as lost and preferred to remain at my desk." One of the many curiosities on Reich-sha's desk was his fantasy on a single chord, an entire piece using only E major chord tones. It may seem odd, but Reich-sha justified it as a practical concept for composers, explaining that the mind, restricted by a lack of means, seeks and finds solutions it would otherwise never have thought of, and thus it attains its goal. In other words, he was advocating for the musical equivalent of putting one arm behind your back, catalyzing invention through constraint. And you can really hear the different characters emerge throughout the piece, despite the monotonous harmony. Such a minimalist piece naturally draws comparisons to 20th century minimalism, though they're not quite the same thing. Reich-sha's fantasy is more conceptual rather than a finished product for performance, but the concept was useful in practice. It brings to mind, among others, Alkan's piano piece based entirely around a repeated F natural. Few kinds of music grapple more with constraints than the fugue, and Reich-sha was obsessed with it. Fugal writing is notoriously laden with rules for how voices should enter, imitate, and interweave. In most fugues, only one voice enters at a time. Sometimes it's two, and more rarely 3 or 4. But Reich-sha wanted to see how far he could push it. In an extreme case, he introduced 6 different fugue subjects at once. This example comes from a set of 36 fugues composed in 1803 that Reich-sha proclaimed as a new approach to the form. We can hear other novelties of his method in number 13, a modal fugue for the white keys only, which is oddly missing that all-important leading tone of the scale. And then there's number 28, written with combined meters that create the feel of an off-kilter dance. work met with criticism, even from Reich's friend Beethoven, who dismissed these new pieces as no fugues at all. Of course, Beethoven would later get the same criticism about his own experiments in counterpoint, but it's easy to understand where Beethoven was coming from. Take a listen to number 18, which is technically a fugue with two subjects, though if you didn't know that in advance, you might think it's just some child plunking away at the keys. More than just counterpoint, Reich-sha also wanted to elevate a more popular genre, variation form, much like Bach had systematically done in his Art of Fugue and Goldberg variations. Clearly inspired by these two, Reich-sha's colossal piano work, The Art of Varying, boasted a whopping 57 variations on an original theme. Published in 1804, the set rivals Beethoven's later Diabelli variations in its comprehensive treatment of a deceptively simple theme. The theme sounds both archaic and folksy, as if Reich-sha were dusting off some ancient tune. The variations range from simple textures, like the improvisation of a rustic fiddler, to flashier moments taken straight out of an etude book. One of my favorites is number 50. Its rocking rhythm always makes me think of some kind of power ballad. Despite not being a virtuoso pianist himself, or perhaps because of it, Reich-sha came up with plenty of unique ideas in these variations. Take number 21, which has these tricky right-hand leaps with a rumbling trill in the bass. And number 32, which keeps getting lost only to find its way again. Number 47 introduces a lively, dotted rhythm that Beethoven used more famously 18 years later, and no, it has nothing to do with jazz, it was a common rhythm in the early 19th century. After several dozen variations, Reicha couldn't help but sum it all up with a modest little fugue. For all of its depth of imagination, the art of varying requires a passionate advocate to bring it off in a live concert, not to mention a charitable audience that has 85 minutes to spare, including repeats. As always, Reich does interesting things, but seems to ask a little too much of his listeners without the prospect of a big payoff. Probably best to study this one at home and perform it in chunks. So what does Reich's music have to offer us today? To me, its most intriguing element is how it leads us down these obscure patterns of musical thought, like a scientist showing us a cutting-edge experiment. First, we hear a normal fugue, then one with several subjects at once, then one that teases out every way to cadence without a leading tone, and so on. Reich wanted his listeners to think outside the box with him. Fittingly, when you Google his name, his title appears not as musician or composer, but educator. In that light, people interested in advanced post-classical counterpoint will find a worthy teacher in Reich. Pianists looking for a quirky fugue that isn't by Bach to play in a lesson or a studio class will have plenty to choose from in Reich's catalog. Those looking for hidden masterworks with rich interpretive depth will likely come away disappointed. But even though Reich's output contains a lot of less than great music, I still find myself dipping back into his catalog from time to time just to see something out of the ordinary, like this weird fugue on Mozart's Hafner Symphony with double octave leaps in the subject. So if you're willing to look past dozens of old-fashioned preludes and pages blackened with dense writing, you'll find that Reicha's piano works were the products of a curious and original mind that is absolutely worth exploring.